Hello friends! Today isn't a proper session. Today, more of a conversation, a recollection of my past. I hope you enjoy it. Hello friends, I am the Dungeon Tutor, welcome. Today, however, even though I am the Dungeon Tutor, today I'm going to step aside and just be Rob. An older gamer who's been around for a while, not as long as some, certainly. But I've seen a thing, and I've done a thing or two, and that's part of the reason why I'm here, to share some of my experiences and some of the fun I've had with gaming. So I'm going to be doing videos on Dungeons and Dragons. You can't have a comprehensive channel about role-playing games without bringing up Dungeons and Dragons. And I will. Absolutely. I'll cover the history, I'll cover the different versions. I probably won't be covering all the ins and outs, the builds and strategies and stuff, but I think what I cover will be enough to help people get into the game and get the most out of it. However, Dungeons and Dragons is a huge topic. There's going to be lots of videos about Dungeons and Dragons, as well as other games that I do love. So, I am going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, D&D, I don't think anybody could question the most influential role-playing game ever. You might debate whether or not it's the greatest. You might debate whether or not it's the best. And those are all very subjective. But I don't think anybody can deny Dungeons and Dragons has made the most money, has gotten the widest range of players, the most penetration, and has been around since the very beginning. So this is my story about Dungeons and Dragons. I hope you enjoy it. So, when I first started role-playing games, the very first game that I actually played, the book would have looked like this. Many folks started Dungeons and Dragons not at 1974, when the game first came out, but instead with the purchase of something like this. This is Dungeons and Dragons as reimagined, taking the core of what makes Dungeons and Dragons, and passed through a filter, mostly at the work of both Gary Gygax, the original creator of Dungeons and Dragons, and Frank Menser, who had been working with TSR, and he made this excellent, what is essentially an introduction to Dungeons and Dragons. Teaches all of the important elements of how to play the game, all the special rules and things to that matter, and it all does it in an entertaining, easy to enjoy package with excellent art by Elmore. This was a wonderful thing to draw people into the game who otherwise might have been frozen out by the reputation of Dungeons and Dragons. When I started in Dungeons and Dragons, it was the tail end of the 80s. So yes, from the sidelines, I had heard about the Satanic Panic and all the other fun stuff with it. But Dungeons and Dragons, at its absolute gribbliest roots, just freshly stepping out of the wargaming field with tactical studies rules, TSR's chainmail, and then later on, the Dungeons and Dragons, the brown box, which was reprinted in the white box, that had the moniker Dungeons and Dragons, and that is the root of where the hobby basically spread out from. So, what did this do for me? This was, again, a wonderful step forward. I had actually seen one of the earliest forms of Dungeons and Dragons, the BX, the basic set. I believe it was the Holmes version of it, and which my parents had. I read it. I was 8 years old. I didn't really understand a lot of it. I just liked reading it. It was some interesting stuff. I loved fantasy. And even though I was 8, I really thought that, it was cool. The dice were cool. They got lost quickly. And after a series of moves, I no longer have that set, which I regret. But it wasn't mine. It was my parents anyhow. They were not the type to have ever actually read it. So, but what did this do? This Dungeons & Dragons introduced a lot of people to the concepts of what role-playing games were and what Dungeons & Dragons specifically is. At its root, Dungeons & Dragons is a game about having fantasy characters in a fantasy world that you as a player control, a dungeon master to oversee everything, tell you everything that happens to your characters, tells you what your characters see, hear, smell, taste, touch, frames the world by putting in interesting creatures and places and monsters, of course, so that you can experience an adventure vicariously through your character. Your characters might die. There's, almost always going to be an element of danger to it, but the character's triumph is uniquely yours. You are the one who is clever enough to get by the traps, tricks, and puzzles. You are the one who experiences all these things, and while your character has abilities and powers and spells, perhaps, that give them an edge in overcoming obstacles, the victory is mostly yours. It isn't about having swaths of skills to roll whenever something comes up that stymies you. It was you trying to outthink the scenario. Oh, there's a trap. I know there's a trap there, but I don't have a thief to get rid of it. Game doesn't stop while you go and get a thief. The game progresses and you figure out how I can thwart that without myself getting hurt or killed. And that was very much a part of the Dungeons & Dragons experience. It was you versus the world, versus the dungeon of the Dungeon Master. Not necessarily partaking in an epic storyline to save the world, save Waterdeep, what have you. Now, with this is just one part of it, of course. This was the Player's Handbook. There was a Dungeon Master's Guide. Same jacket, just Dungeon Master's Guide. There were dice and character sheets, order form, all the fun stuff in a box set. I no longer have the box. I didn't really value keeping all of those. These are easy to tote around. Yes, the collectors among you might cringe at that, but still, that's kind of how I rolled. There were several sets. This was just the first step. It was intended to take characters further and further along, but this was a great introduction because this told you what a role-playing game is, and probably the most effectively I've ever seen. It immediately throws you into a choose-your-own adventure style introduction, which slowly ticks over what are attributes. How do you make an attack roll? How do you make a saving throw? Those are the core mechanics of a game that you will use again and again and again. And artfully explained. It was really good for that. In a very conversational tone, too. This didn't read like a dry manual like some games do. It just, these are the rules, and line by line, rules, rules, rules. This was more, no, this is how your character feels about this experience. The interaction between the NPC is something that actually has meaning. The NPC is friendly, therefore your character can relax a little bit, knows he's going to get a pretty good deal from the merchant. There's also the opposite where, you meet an evil wizard. What do? He tries to cast a spell on you. If you succeed, he casts a spell on me. Attack! And if he casts a spell and charms you, it's, hey buddy, how's it going? We're okay. I thought you were going to attack me for a second. Nah, you're my friend. It's really placed out well. And this gives you a really good idea of what life in a Dungeons & Dragons world is when it's not just combat, combat, combat. Which is something that the original versions of Dungeons & Dragons were kind of guilty of. The idea of role-playing in non-combat scenarios was really highlighted in this. Of course, there was plenty on the combat, too. How to do it, most especially. Because, at its heart, Dungeons & Dragons is a very simple game. It's not terribly complicated unless you make it so. And that comes out very clearly in the rules. The whole idea of these BX sets, the Mold and Holmes versions, were two. The art wasn't quite as good. It wasn't Elmore art, but it was still nice. but they were simple booklets that explained Dungeons and Dragons in a way that somebody didn't have to be super smart and follow up with all of Gary Gygax's $10 words. Not when smaller, easier language was easier to comprehend and take in and teach you this game that you might be playing for years and years. Also, this wasn't a book that was designed to let you play for years and years. This was your foretaste. This was your introduction. And while there were entry-level adventures, like, Keep on the Borderlands was a pretty common one, they were a leaping off point. This was to get you the idea of what it is, introduce itself, give you enough experience to figure out, oh, leveling up is pretty cool. I can now do more cool things. I am farther away from dying, and I can have access to new powers and abilities. That's really cool. But once you hit that 3rd level, what's more to do? Well, this tells you, go get the expert set, which will cover 3rd to 10th level. Okay, well, if you go and get that, you find, oh, hey, there's more stuff. There's more weapons, more choices, more equipment. And this will help because it also introduces you to the idea of not just going from your home into the dungeon, back out to rest and recuperate, back into the dungeon to grab the loot. It's all about getting loot, too. There wasn't, again, overriding stories. It was about earning the treasure and leveling up. Survival, kind of baked in there, too. So, yes, Dungeons & Dragons taught the essential elements of what role-playing games were like in an old-school fashion. How to make the characters and make them quick. Characters didn't take a lot of time. 3d6, straight down the line. Told you what character class you were going to play because that was the one with probably your best stat. And you made up your character and picked out your gear, and it could all be done in 5-10 minutes, easy. So if your character died, you could be right back in the action as soon as the Game Master can get you in. Excellent. For people who did not form immense attachments to their characters because death was fairly common, and at the same time, your characters were fragile on purpose because that was a consequence of failure, right? Is your character dying, losing it, possibly losing everything they had worked up for. As opposed to modern day games where death is relatively, well, infrequent. Because there's so many elements that are tied to the individual character. Their place in the story is pretty important. Too important to just be lost in a common casual encounter. But back in the day, you weren't special. You were an adventurer and probably above average. Maybe even significantly so. With the addition of a couple of levels, your character was pretty cool. And your average citizen would just be, wow, that person's a great adventurer. But they weren't immortal. And it took a long time before you would be the stuff of legends. And yes, if you could get a character to 36th level, which was the top level of Basic Expert Companion Masters Immortal set, called BECME, I will abbreviate this as we go, your character would be ultimately at 36th level and possibly knocking on the door for your character to become an immortal. So, that was my first experience, was getting into that version of it for playing sake. And it was a great time. I played with plenty of friends, made some very good friends through the game. But at its heart, one of the charms of the game is, and always has been, it is the gateway to role-playing games through a lot of very accessible means. If you like fantasy, if you like Tolkien, for instance, J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, all of it, The Hobbit, the Fellowship, all of that stuff, it's excellent fodder for fantasy roleplay. But, an important thing to remember, Dungeons & Dragons kicks it up a notch. It is not Tolkienian fantasy. It is a more elevated style of fantasy into high magic. Wizards exist and are a way of life. In Tolkien, wizards are very rare, and true wizards are not even human. So, sorry, Gandalf isn't human. That's why he's incredibly awesome. Well, it's part of the reason. But when you're playing Dungeons & Dragons, you're just a normal human wizard. Or maybe you're an elf, or a halfling, or a dwarf. You are just a normal person trying to make your way as best you can, and if you are lucky, and if you are good as a player to keep your character giving the best chances of survival, you can survive, you can succeed, you can get very rich, very powerful, and only you really determine when the game is over. I mean, your character could die and you can make another one, but you might decide that, my character has done enough. He can retire. He can go build a castle somewhere and live happily with the money he's earned from adventuring. Or maybe he can pledge himself to some great cause that he's interested in. That's up to you. That part is somewhat nebulous. Many games didn't go any further than what was considered name level, which was 9th or 10th level. Because a lot of the charm of the game is early on when your characters are still vulnerable, when your characters are still learning their craft and quickly ascending to power. At higher levels, it takes longer. It takes a lot more experience to go up levels. So yes, you are getting more because you are tackling greater challenges and you are taking in greater amounts of wealth. But there's something about that low level that some people really fell in love with. And I from talking to many people and my own experiences, it was not uncommon to retire characters if you were playing in an open world where you just go into the dungeon or travel to another kingdom or something like that. Retiring your characters and maybe putting them into the world. Maybe, well, from now on, the tower of that former player character now stands as a place where other wizards can get training, can learn new spells, because that player retired their character and built a tower with them. Cool. And again, that was not a unique experience. Lots of people played it that way, and perfectly fine. On the other hand, you do hear sometimes about games that have gone on for 20, 25, 30, 35, 40 years. And maybe generations of characters that have lived and strove and died in that world. And that's also an effective way of playing. It could be a lot of fun to have a world that is so comfortable because you've explored so much of it and left your imprint on so much of the world that it becomes very familiar. I personally always liked games that had some teeth to it, that you could bite into the world and feel like you're a part of it, but at the same time I wanted to move on to something else, try another game, try another campaign world. Always something new, always something to explore. Sometimes different place in the same world if the world was big enough, but sometimes just an entirely different world with different peoples and struggles and cultures and challenges and experiences to have. And D&D can provide that very comfortably. Now, of course, I didn't play just basic Dungeons & Dragons. I had a group that played advanced Dungeons & Dragons. And some people call that first edition, which is kind of a misnomer because the very first edition of Dungeons & Dragons was the brown and white boxes, the original Dungeons & Dragons, which still had its roots in wargaming because the engine that drove the ship was chainmail, which was a wargaming set of rules. And the Dungeons & Dragons part of it was the adaptation that told you how to level characters. Told you about all the different monsters that, fantasy monsters not typically found in wargames. And that could all work together so that it would guide your play and let you see how you could take your unit of one and, best your opponents with tactics, with good fortune, with powerful magic and things of that nature. Budgeting resources, like how many spells your magic user has. How often can you use your power? That was a major part of that game. Again, it's the personal reward of your character surviving as a reflection of your skills as a player. And if you played in that time with other people, oftentimes you learn the game through other people, as I did. I learned from playing with very good players. I learned about a lot of pitfalls that players can commonly fall into that even today still teach valid lessons. For instance, if I'm your game master and you have searched a door thoroughly, which is a good idea generally in Dungeons & Dragons, if it's a mysterious door in a dungeon, you want to make sure there's no traps, you want to make sure there's no magical tricks or anything like that, using the resources you can. The magic user has scanned it by detecting magic upon it. There's no magic. The thief or rogue, depending on your edition, has examined it and they give you the thumbs up, there's no traps on this door. So, you open the door. You've listened at the door, presumably? Nothing moving. Okay. You open the door. You see what's in front of you. What is revealing itself by opening the door? then you poke your head inside and look up. If you do that, I can tell you that there's a giant spider that's above the door waiting to ambush the first person to open the door. And you would see it if you tell me specifically your character looks up, because that great big spider up there can't hide really effectively. It's counting on ambushing. It's counting on dropping on the first fool who walks through the door. If you just poke your head in and look up and you see it, you can react. But some people who are trapped by dice, who don't have the experience of old school games, might go, okay, go ahead and roll a perception check. If they have the means to see that spider and they look exactly where that spider is, I don't care how good your hide check is. I don't care how badly you roll for us. You just missed this huge hulking spider up there. You can still use old school elements in modern games too. I've found, and I myself do use those kind of techniques. And players generally seem to appreciate it, that they can diffuse a nasty situation for their character by thinking and using their personal skills to help out in the game. It works pretty well for the most part. But even so, modern games, as Dungeons & Dragons has evolved from the original, the wood grain box, one of the holy grails of collectors, something I do not have, to the white box, which a little bit refined, a little bit smoother design, but for the most part, the same game. That was the next thing that TSR then put out in mass. And they also elaborated. There were a lot of other supplements that came out. There were adventures. There were products like Rogues Gallery, which had a lot of pre-rolled characters, heroes of the game, things like that. They started to really roll out expansions to the core game itself, like Greyhawk and Blackmoor, and other elements that helped a person to have more ammunition for their imagination. New character classes, some intrinsic character classes that we think of today, like thieves/rogues or monks, came about because of expansions to the game. Early on, it was just clerics, magic users, and fighting men. That's how it went. So, there were some missteps along the way. There were some things that people today really don't care for, which is fine. Those are all artifacts of the time period that they went through, putting everything into context. If you, for example, find it somewhat insulting that female characters had different maximums, for example, they had their strength cap, they could not be as strong as the strongest human man, your strong human female warrior, that was just how they saw the world through the filter of the game. While it may potentially, I'm not familiar with any numbers, that it may be that no woman has lifted as much weight as the strongest men, or whatever standard you want to use, most people agree that that's kind of an artifact of the past, which is fine. And you could always ignore the rules you didn't like anyhow. That was pretty much part and parcel of the game, and expressly mentioned in Gary's treatise in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Just use the parts that you like. These are mostly suggestions and guidelines as much as hard and fast rules. The only time you have to follow the rules diligently is when you're playing in a tournament competitively against other people. In your own home game, use what you want. Enjoy the game however you will. And those kind of lessons really did form the opinions, but also the play style and outlook of a lot of gamers in the time. So that was my first experience, was basic Dungeons & Dragons. Then I slid into advanced Dungeons & Dragons. And that was always the intention of the basic expert sets. This is your taste of it. Now you are ready for the full game. It gets a bit more complicated, more choices, but it should feel similar. The core elements of the game will be similar. Cool. It all worked out fairly well. And yeah, I did find that the overlap worked out for me extraordinarily well. My very first Advanced Dungeons & Dragons character, my group made for me because they needed a cleric. If you've played from back in the day, that might sound familiar, because that's a lot of people's experience playing Dungeons & Dragons. Hey, can I play with you? Sure, we need a cleric. That's what you're playing. Enjoy. And in truth, that's not necessarily a bad way of playing, because the others are generally going to have the skill positions that may be more glamorous already taken. So you can take a role that's comfortable and in support of the others and learn your craft as you are playing. And the others will support you as you are playing, because a cleric is an investment. A healer is somebody that keeps your group going in tough battles. They may not be as useful in relatively simple or common encounters, but when it all hits the fan, you will be very happy to have somebody who can competently play some sort of a healer in the old days. So, even 2nd edition, going to 2nd edition, there were some significant changes, and 2nd edition was my college experience. Prior to that, it was all basic and advanced. Then, almost all of my college experience was 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons, which did feel very much like advanced Dungeons and Dragons, just, again, smoother. Some of the, how do I put it, a little bit more clunky and cumbersome parts of advanced Dungeons and Dragons, like the optional bardic class, which felt weird, and to a certain extent psionics, which became purely optional with an expanded book, were discount, just gone. And the art improved. The lessons they learned with the basic expert set, the red box being an extremely successful product, what caught people's attention was art like that on your front cover. People saw that and they wanted it. They wanted into this world that was revealed through this kind of art. And looking through this book, there's a lot of, again, realistic, beautiful fantasy art. And it works really well. And when you look in 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, the art is beautiful. Again, it's this very realistic art. It's very, very colorful, very, very splashy, and draws the attention in. And in 2nd edition, you have even more hands. TSR has grown quite a bit. And as a result, there have been some changes to the game. Nothing to the core. You still roll a 20-sided die, and you look at an attack matrix, and you can see what armor class you hit, and if you hit, you roll damage. Basic core combat. Magic can get interspersed in there too? Sure. But we could probably talk a little bit about THAC0. THAC0, acronym, 2 hit armor class 0, is a floating number. That number floats as you get experience. It goes down. Weird. You go up in level, and it goes down. Why? Because hitting armor class of 0 is kind of the measuring stick. Armor class 0 is your absolutely best armored person. Full suited plate and a shield. There are ways of dropping it below that, but that's your best armor. So that is generally the most difficult armor you're going to have to hit at low levels. So, knowing what you have to roll on a 20-sided die to hit that number is a useful frame of reference. Because armor classes back then went from theoretical 10, most people I think it was a 9, and then it would drop down to a 0 the better protected you get. And it could go as low as, again, realistically, -10, which was incredibly protected. I have seen resources as low as -14, but that was about it. And that made sense to us at the time. There wasn't a pushback against it. It just, you learned how to do THAC0. Your THAC0 number, which dropped as you went up levels, represented your chance of hitting a 0. And because it was a lower number, you were more likely to hit it with a roll of a 20-sided die. Because you had a range from that number, or whatever number the armor class, to hit that armor class of your opponent, on up was a success. So if your THAC0 was a 5, because you were an experienced adventurer, then opponents who have a 0 armor class, again, as good as most people practically could get with expensive armor and a good shield without magic, you hit 75% of the time. That's not including bonuses for high strength, bonuses for magic, penalties for their defensive magics, and whatever other circumstances. But that gave you a frame of reference of how likely you were to succeed in combat. It also learned really quickly that wizards go down very slowly, and thieves go down fairly slowly. Not as slow as wizard, but pretty slowly. Clerics went down fairly slowly, but faster than thieves at least. And fighters just, whoosh, every time you go down a level, go up a level, Thaco drops. Which was great, because you needed that. That was your only real asset that you had as a fighter, was having great to hit. And there were some elements from the other game resources that came out in Dungeons & Dragons that were brought into the basic game of 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons. So, barbarians, bards. The bard got a complete remake, which was nice. And, you know, monks were a little different. There were some changes that were quality of life improvements. You also had some interesting directions they took. For example, they took the monster manual and they turned it into this binder full of loose leaf sheets, double-sided, with all of your monsters. There were some problems. The binder itself was enormous, and you could put several blocks of these creature stats into that and pull out the ones that you needed. There was a certain amount of facility in that idea. The problem was the pages themselves were just hole cut. There were no protectors on them. A smart person would have put ring protectors around the holes, basically like a grommet, to stop the pages from tearing, or at least slow down that effect. I did not, and several of my pages ripped, which is unfortunate. The entire affair was fairly fragile. Eventually they came out with the Monstrous Manual, which was a bound book, and again, full color and actually quite nice, with the most popular hits from the monster manuals up to this point. And again, 2nd edition took some real risks, some challenges, because the game wanted to evolve. The players, the consumers, wanted more out of the game. So they came out with all kinds of kit books. The Complete Adventurer, the Adventurer's Guide to Fighters, Wizards, Clerics, Thieves, all of it. Every class got its own book. And in those books, they had something called kits, which were ways of streamlining your character, making them even better at one thing they cared about, and getting rid of abilities that really weren't essential towards that particular bent. Some of them were really esoteric and kind of fun. Some of them were just overpowered. Some of them were quizzically not very useful. But this was an option. Changing the way the core classes worked was a very 2nd edition AD&D thing to do. Also, when you got towards the tail end of 2nd edition's run, they came out with other books like combat options and skills and powers, which further broke the idea of what some of these core elements are. For example, one of the suggestions they had were all of the attributes: strength, intelligence, dexterity, wisdom, constitution, charisma. We all knew those statistics. Well, skills and powers suggested maybe breaking those in half, so that in strength, instead of just strength, you could have muscle, which I think is how well you hit and the like. And the other one was how well you could put out a sustained effort, affecting your carrying and lifting. So basically, you could really min-max what you cared about, is ultimately what that ended up doing. There were a lot of options in those books. Some of them were good, well-conceived ideas that would add a flexibility to the game that it didn't have before. Others just served to make the game more complicated and in some cases, very broken. So eventually, 2nd edition in my college years passed by, and a couple of years after my college years, I had heard that TSR wasn't doing so well. They had gone bankrupt. And eventually, they were bought by Wizards of the Coast, who prior to that were the Magic the Gathering people to me. And I am very familiar with Magic the Gathering. But the deal with that was the Wizards of the Coast was not tied down to, we have to keep Dungeons and Dragons sacred cows intact. including the reliance on the #1 world being Greyhawk. Turns out that the player base had changed. Many people were brought into interest in Dungeons & Dragons because of the writing of Ed Greenwood and R.A. Salvatore. So when people are getting their fix of Driss, they're not really so interested in Greyhawk and the Shieldlands and Iuz and the Duchy of Ten. They want Waterdeep. They want Baldur's Gate. They want the Sword Coast, because lots of exciting things happen there, and that's where their imagination is taking them. Which, again, TSR knew. They put out all kinds of fun, interesting materials for the Forgotten Realms, but when Wizards of the Coast got a hold of it, their idea was, we should give it more credence. The very first series, the 3rd edition of Dungeons & Dragons, as they call it, again, there had been more than 3 editions prior, but we'll just go with that, marked a cleaving point. Dungeons & Dragons once again changed and metamorphosed. And it wasn't bad. I really did like 3rd edition. Even more choices. So many choices. Now you decide where your skills go. So everybody gets skills, and unlike earlier editions of D&D, it was integrated into the core idea of Dungeons & Dragons for everything. Roll a 20-sided die, see what the result is when you add up anything that needs to be added to it or subtracted, and compare it against the target number that you're shooting for. Meet or exceed it, you succeed. Fail to meet it, you failed. Black and white, easy to understand. And generally you would try to keep your activities to things that your character was good at. It made sense. You'd use the things that you have bonuses for. And game masters would constantly try to get you to do things that you weren't skilled in, just, so you occasionally fail. But there was a number of things. First of all, no attack matrix or anything like that. That was gone. No more THAC0. Everything's simple math. Armor classes go up. Better armor class, better armor, magic, and everything. Up, 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 up. So your difficulties went up as well. Interesting. In earlier versions of Dungeons & Dragons, if you wanted to try something that wasn't specifically based on combat, say you wanted to push a boulder, you would roll against your strength. You would roll the die and try to get lower than your strength. Possibly with a penalty, like half of your strength if it was something particularly heavy. That was not really in any of the books expressly, but a lot of people use those rules. And I found that you're changing your systems. You want to roll high in combat, but you want to roll low for that. When you're doing specialized work, thieves work, you roll percentile dice. Everything else is done with a 20-sided die, but you're rolling percentile dice. Why is that? Well, for one thing, it was literally bolted in from somebody else's idea. I think the thieves originally came from, was it Blackmoor or was it Greyhawk? I think it was Blackmoor. I think Greyhawk had monks. But anyhow, thieves. So you have a percentile chance of success, and it's not simply by 5%, so it doesn't perfectly match up with your 20-sided die, which each facet of that is a 5% likelihood. So I can kind of see why that happened, but at the same time, looking at what 3rd edition did to it, with everything being a 20-sided die roll and add your bonuses to hit a target number, that's a simple system that extends throughout the whole game. Everything. Saving throws, you want to roll high. Hit rolls, you want to roll high. Skill checks, you want to roll high. It all makes sense. It's all integrated together with, again, a beautiful package. Wizards of the Coast had amazing art. It was really excellent, and it was very eye-catching. And their ambitions for Dungeons & Dragons were extremely interesting because they put out a lot of product. But here's the thing. They realized back in the day that Dungeons & Dragons could really be something special, especially if they had help, if they didn't have to produce everything. TSR had an antagonistic attitude towards a lot of developers and designers who wanted to take D&D and rip it off and use it for their stuff. You had to work with TSR if you wanted to make Dungeons & Dragons compatible materials. Even if the actual system itself could not be copyrighted, if you wanted to work with Dungeons & Dragons and segue along with it, you wanted to work with TSR, otherwise they might actually send you a cease and desist. That had happened. So this time Wizards of the Coast said, no, we want everybody to make D&D stuff. So the Open Gaming License came out, and Dungeons and Dragons dominated. Absolutely dominated. After 2000, there was so much stuff that if you go into any bookstore that has gaming materials, there's a whole section just for Dungeons and Dragons, because everybody was in on that. Bigger companies like Green Ronin, like Mongoose Publishing, like Troll Lord. These are companies that really kicked in and started making very high-end content for Dungeons and Dragons. Not to mention the smaller companies, too, that were likewise using D&D as a platform so that they could get their adventures out. They could get their interesting stuff out. It was a truly rich time. If you were playing D&D, you could pick and choose and pick and choose. And you really had to pick, because there was also stuff that was coming out that wasn't all that good. There was very exploitative stuff that made loopholes in rules that players liked, but it could ultimately alter the balance of your games. So you had to pick and choose. But it was a wide open platform. And the idea of prestige classes, now I don't just have the core classes to pick from, which I can now multi-class through at will, so we'll talk about that in a second. But you have prestige classes, things you can shoot for that give you specialized abilities and skills that, again, further narrow your focus, but make your character have the abilities that you're really dreaming of. This led to the idea of builds. The idea of taking the rules as they stand, all of the prestige classes available, the character classes available, and figuring out how you can hodgepodge different classes and different prestige classes together, multi-classing all the way, to make the most powerful character. Or angling for something else. Maybe you don't want to make the most powerful character. Maybe you want to make a character that can never be hit. Maybe you want to make an unkillable character that has so many hit points they practically don't have to wear armor. Especially back when the heal spell cured everything. More on that some other time. And you could do all this, and this was something that people were talking about online a lot. These were subjects of conversation. How you can make a character into a god. One of these days I'll talk about pun, but yes, that was a conversation that people had, was how can I take this game and just twist it till it breaks? Or at the very least come up with some of the most obvious vehicles for just pure power to possibly break the game, to make sure your character is always the coolest one in the room, etc., etc., etc. And that's never stopped since 3rd edition. It's very likely there was stuff like that in 2nd edition as well, especially with all the kits, but the internet wasn't quite the same place back then. There were some great sites for role-playing games and stuff, I remember, but especially in the late 90s. But all the same, it exploded in the year 2000. 2001, 2002, just... And if you allowed at your table all the different books that were available, it could only get crazier and crazier. Now, my experience with 3rd edition, I liked it. I loved the ideas behind it. But running it could be a huge pain in the butt. And there were some things you just couldn't get away from, especially at higher levels. Higher level play in 3rd edition to me is... I like the roleplay aspect of it, but man, the combats. The higher level you are, the busy you are. If you're a warrior type, you get iterative attacks. You get to attack multiple times, and each attack is staggered lower and lower. You have a less likely chance to hit with your later attacks. But you still have to roll them all, and if they hit, you roll damage for each attack separately. This takes more time. I mean, it already takes more time if a wizard has a wide range of spells and they're considering their spells. That's why a good player will look that stuff up while other people are taking their turns. Yes, and we'll talk about that. But in this particular case, 5th edition or 3rd edition D&D could be really rough at high levels. And I did run an epic campaign that went up into the high 20s, early 30s. Yeah, that was an interesting campaign. But all things eventually come to an end, right? And we played for quite a bit. We played other games in that span too. But eventually, there were enough complaints about some of the exploits and some of the loopholes in the rules for 3rd edition that they felt they needed to come out with a 3.5 edition. And honestly, the changes they made were sensible. They stopped some of the silly things that people were able to do with the rules, and also some of the things that just kind of really broke the game without supposing to be that... They're not supposed to be that powerful. Like the heal spell. The heal spell, touch somebody, they're fully healed. Well, when characters can get up in the 300 hit point range, all the effort you put to hurt them to where they're feeling threatened, instantly, whew, gone. They're all healed. Now what? This was exemplified in a game that I played when my players, who had a cleric who was capable and did enjoy using the heal spell, they set upon an ancient red dragon in their lair. After a round or two of beating on the dragon and critically hurting it, but sustaining some pretty impressive damage, the dragon jumped into a pool of lava. The party could not follow him. The party got up, started healing, and then the dragon dropped on top of them, completely healed because it had used a heal spell. It did that 2 more times, making a fight with a, I think, 375 hit point dragon. The dragon effectively had over 1,000 hit points in that fight because it kept breaking off to heal and pouncing back. Eventually, they did kill it, but it was an epic battle that probably shouldn't have been as epic if the dragon didn't use the same tricks the players were using against them, as a good game master is perfectly capable of doing. So 3.5 changed things like the heal spell. The polymorph spell was another one that took some big changes, but the heal spell now could only heal, I think, about up to 150 maximum. And that was fine. I think it was 10 points per level up to 150. Reasonable, kept it at a certain power band at 5th level, but didn't allow the exploits that full heals used to do. And that was quality of life changes. It made sense. Some people may have grumbled, it's just Wizards of the Coast trying to sell a new batch of books. And I have both sets. I have the players, and I have the 3rd, and I have the 3.5 edition. And yeah, the changes weren't drastic, but there were some really good changes that did smooth the game out a bit. Didn't make high-level play any easier, though. I'll say that. So, Dungeons & Dragons, with all this flexibility, all this stuff that Wizards of the Coast had put out, but also that everybody else had put out. Admittedly, again, huge section of the bookstore and gaming stores were going to be Dungeons & Dragons, because so many companies were producing for it. Then they went to 4th edition. They decided, that's enough, we need a new edition, 4th edition. And for a lot of people, including myself, this is really where the wheels came off of the wagon. Because 4th edition had a different flavor, a different tone, and they changed the open gaming license. They still had something like it, but it wasn't nearly as generous to allow people to just freely use the D&D content as long as they didn't touch certain things that are purely reserved for Wizards of the Coast, and they always attributed it. That's why you would always see the open gaming license boilerplate on one page in any book that uses OGL stuff at all. A process that continues to this day. Doesn't matter what the publisher is, if they don't want to get sued into oblivion, you put that boilerplate in and you're golden. The open gaming license is very broad and very flexible. There was a kerfluffle at the beginning of 2022, and we'll discuss that. But yes, the open gaming license still really did help 3rd edition tremendously. 4th edition, not so much. There was some third-party support for 4th edition because it's the new edition of Dungeons & Dragons, the biggest game in the land. Yeah, about that. Fan reaction to 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons was not good. For one thing, it wasn't your editions that you liked. The game felt very different, and it was very different. Even though the core of the game was still the same, roll a 20-sided die and try to hit the target number. That's always worked for Dungeons & Dragons well. When it was the only game in town in 3rd edition, it was still the only game in town in 4th edition, but they had done so much to change the classes and blur them all together, so that now there were only truly 4 classes in the game. But wait, I hear you say, what about bards and druids? And They did create a bunch of classes, yes, but ultimately most of them were copy and paste from other ones that were within the same core class. Your strikers, your leaders, your tanks, your controllers. And it worked. It was a game. You could play it. But it was really focused on encounter by encounter play. The challenge of dealing with an encounter and using your skills and abilities. Monsters having a variety of roles to help the game master come up with challenging encounters. It was actually a master class in how to set up an encounter, but it was not really good at helping to tell a unified story and in a unified world, or have higher aspirations for more than that. So a lot of people didn't like it. I ran it for a while. I had a group of players that kind of revolted against it. They did not like the system at all. We moved on to play other games. But I can speak with some authority in 4th edition that I don't think it was a terrible game system. It just had some glaring flaws. Had you just called it Dungeons & Dragons Tactics, it probably would have done okay as a kind of a side curiosity for people who love miniature game warfare. You could have had a really vibrant thing running a kind of a side league using that edition. But that's what it was. And that did allow Wizards of the Coast to fall off the top of the pile. Paizo, the company that they had employed to make their magazines, Dragon and Dungeon, that they cut off when 4th edition came out, made their game, which was a further evolution of 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons, called Pathfinder. And for a while, Pathfinder was actually the most sold game in fantasy role-playing, and role-playing games in general. They ruled the roost for a while. 4th edition did not have the same appeal. And while there are people who love 4th edition, there are people who started playing D&D at 4th edition, and God bless, it's not a terrible game. But, that being said, eventually it had to change. And where did we end up? We ended up where we are at now, with 5th edition. Now, 5th edition, I've run a couple of campaigns in 5th edition. I've run their story path, and I made my own. It is when I say evolution, most people understand that evolution is the survival of the fittest. You go on to create more of your species, taking all of your positive things and carrying them forward. 5th edition was an evolution of Dungeons and Dragons as a total. It took things from every other edition and brought some things back that had been lost, and learn from every version, including 4th edition, bringing in some things that really did change the flavor and give players a variety of choices. You don't have prestige classes anymore, it's true, but you do have branching paths that you can take in each of the core classes, which kind of fill the same role. You actually have had another class, the Artificer, created midstream as an official class added to the rest of the list, and that's pretty cool. At its heart, it's still the same D&D. Yes, you don't have all of the different skills that you had in 3rd edition. You have a smaller number of skills, and you don't have to worry about putting skill ranks into various skills. You just have proficiency, or you don't. Kind of like 5th edition, or 4th edition. But 4th edition was just a flat +5 bonus. Now you have, well, ultimately you have numbers that go up very, very slowly. And that is kind of one of the things that was called back from earlier versions of Dungeons & Dragons. The numbers don't get big and crazy like they were in 3rd edition. So higher level gameplay isn't as traumatic as... Really, I still remember running some of those big combats from back in the day. Entire nights spent in 1 or 2 combats. Oy. Now, a big part of enjoying Dungeons & Dragons, depending on your tastes, and your tastes are probably different than mine, is figuring out what you like and getting the most out of it. To me, combat isn't the greatest part of a role-playing game. So I've found ways of streamlining role-playing games that I can let you in on, in terms of Dungeons & Dragons, certainly, down the road with other videos. I think that it's really essential, unless you absolutely love the cut and thrust of combat, to get through combats and make them meaningful and exciting. Yeah, I know a few things. I got some tips for you, but that'll be in another video. 5th edition is an interesting time for Dungeons & Dragons. It's accomplished the most amount of success for an Editions campaign that Dungeons & Dragons or any role-playing game has ever had. It is the world's greatest role-playing game in terms of sales, in terms of accessibility. Wizards of the Coast has invested a tremendous amount in making sure that if you're interested in the Dungeons & Dragons, you get the Dungeons & Dragons. And they're turning now towards monetizing it and making more money from it, which I think is a little sad, but it's kind of part of the evolution of a game company that was allowed to have some fun, but now its parent company Hasbro really wants to make some money off of it, so they're going to have to start doing that. Which, if you really love something, you shouldn't be afraid of throwing a few dollars at it, perhaps, but you also have to, be a little wary sometimes in the modern day. So, that's been my experience from Dungeons & Dragons. Starting off as a kid in high school, before that slightly, and at least reading some of the Dungeons & Dragons, but as a kid in high school, running the game, getting my chops in, learning how to tell stories, making most of my friends in life through the game. Some of my best friends have come from my shared gaming experiences, sitting at my table or, playing in a dormitory. We did that. And playing in basements, absolutely. But it touched my life in a very concrete way. And I can't say, even though it's trendy to dunk on Dungeons & Dragons for those people who aren't immense fans, the hipster vibe of, Dungeons & Dragons is the common course for entry-level gamers. But, the more sophisticated gamers will play something, Dungeons & Dragons is still the most popular game for a reason. It's very accessible. It's a decent game that allows you to do an incredible amount of things that you can do with fantasy. It's robust enough that you can play other styles of game using the core, which we do see and we'll talk about. But ultimately, Dungeons & Dragons is a force in gaming. It brings in new players. It gives them a solid experience, and in the main, Dungeons & Dragons is robust enough to handle an awful lot that you could overlook some of the things that it doesn't do particularly well. And there are things. There's a good reason to play other games too. But it's never a bad thing to have at least good working knowledge of Dungeons & Dragons. It's been one of the most successful systems in history for role-playing games. And as a result, we have to talk about it. So that's why I'm going to be doing a number of videos as Dungeon Tutor regarding all of this Dungeons & Dragons stuff. How to get into it, how to play it, and how to get the most fun out of it. I hope you come along for the ride. It should be a lot of fun. But this is my experience, and I hope you liked it. This is the kind of thing that I will be bringing to bear to any game that I start to cover, and hopefully you appreciate this little bit more autobiographical part. Understand where I'm coming from. If I have some biases that seep into what I say, well, perhaps these will explain how those came about, but I'm not going to break down campaign by campaign all the campaigns that I've run in Dungeons and Dragons, but my ideas and the concepts that I have were informed by those kind of experiences, and some of those stories will definitely still be coming out. Just matter of time, circumstance, and of course what you as the players and dungeon masters of the future, present, who like my stuff, want to see, want to hear about. Just let me know. Leave it in the comments below, and you can direct the next conversation that we have, or prompt me to put out some lessons to help you or to help somebody you know who has questions about gaming in my role as Dungeon Tutor. But until that next time, I'm just Rob, just a gamer who owes a lot to a lifetime of playing role-playing games, getting great friends, and being entertained. I hope you also have that journey and enjoy it the entirety of the way. There will be some bumps, there will be some hurdles, but together, hopefully we can make this an enjoyable thing for you for the rest of your life. So until the next time, my friends, I am the Dungeon Tutor, and I'm grateful for you being here. Until the next time, I hope that you yourself, yes, you, get a chance to roll some dice, to play some games, to have fun, but stay safe out there, my friends. Until that next time, farewell.